Hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. The topic for today is the rise of Islam and Islam's golden age. So, roughly from around 600 AD until the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate in 900 AD. Um, and this is a time period that not that many people think about, but it's one of the most important time periods in history by a pretty significant margin. Like you'd think, because Islam's got 2 billion people, or it's over a billion people today. And that means that the choices that were made in this time period have ripple effects that push outwards for a lot of people for a very long time. Uh, and Islamic civilization is very front loaded, in which, for the West, lots of the important historic events happen later on in the 18th or 19th centuries. And the West's origins in the Middle Ages are kind of obscure. For Islam, it's the opposite, in which the period where they did the most and where they were most impressive was at the very beginning. And Islam has the rest of Muslim history has been a overt attempt to return to the glory of the first of Muhammad and his time and of the first few caliphates.
I'm excited to get into it. There's a lot to
Yeah,
lot to
there
unpack.
is. So it's interesting where I don't think there's a lot of good reasons for why Muhammad existed, where you look at certain historic periods of history and you can find very easy causal events which caused them. Where for the Axial Age around 500 BC, with Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Socrates, maybe Zoroaster, that was around the invention of coinage. And so those philosophers arrived in areas that had coins. And with Christianity, you can talk about the Roman Empire. I'm unclear what the factor that resulted in Muhammad was, because if you look at the foundation of all the world's religions, Islam is by far the latest, where you have the axial age religions, which I said before, all happened at the same time. And then the Abrahamics are on their own special track, in which there was Judaism, and out of Judaism came Christianity, and out of that came Islam. And so those are, you're either an axial age religion or you're an Abrahamic religion. That's basically the calculation. And I can't find a good answer for why Muhammad showed up. And I think he might be one of those historic figures who, out of sheer force of will, and if you're a Muslim, you would say divine intervention, has just changed the world. Where you look at everything Muhammad created, and it's absolutely astonishing. And it's really this one man built something absolutely incredible. And he has my immense respect on multiple different levels. Um, and and so let's go into the world that Muhammad lived in, because only by understanding the context can you figure out what was happening. Where I'll put up a map here, but the Middle East of that time period, the western half of it was dominated by the Greek speaking Eastern Roman Empire, and the east of it was dominated by the Persians. And there's a people called the Semites, and the Semites are the people in Iraq and Arabia. Jews are Semites. And so the people of the Fertile Crescent, and the Fertile Crescent is a term. It's funny, we haven't had any episodes in Middle Eastern history yet, but the Fertile Crescent is this arc of territory from Egypt, Israel, Syria, and then back down through Iraq. That area was inhabited by Christian Semites at the time, like Syrians, and it was one of the wealthiest and most advanced and most prosperous places in the world. And a lot happened in that area. Well, we might cover it in a Hellenism video. And so it was a big area of cultural innovation, but it was ruled by Greek and Persian speakers. And the Roman Empire in the western half, in like Italy and France and North and Tunisia, that fell apart. The eastern half kept going for another 1,000 years, and the eastern half became culturally Greek. And so you had these Greek speakers who were coming out of modern Turkey, which was Greeks at this time period. Turkey was ethnically Greek. They ruled the area around Syria and Egypt and Palestine, and that region the Byzantines were stuck in these kind of retarded, intractable religious conflicts, where they had these religious conflicts, and these are all Christians, between, because Christianity existed for 600 years before Islam, where they'd talk about, was Christ divine before he was reincarnated? Was he divine at the moment of reincarnation? Was Christ not divine? It was these tiny arguments over minutiae of theology, and this split the Byzantine Empire into civil wars. And so what happened was you had these sects of Christians who weren't part of the majority religion, who weren't part of the dominant Orthodox religion, and people like the Nestorians or the Copts. And so you had this giant dissatisfied Christian population inside the Christian Eastern Roman Empire. And then if you want to look at the Persian Empire, the Persians were split between modern Iraq or Mesopotamia, which was demographically most people in the Persian Empire. And Persia is a civilization that goes back thousands of years. It goes back very far. And the Persians were a proud, established society that had had many empires that ruled the Middle East. And the Romans and the Persians had split the Middle East for, I'd say, like 700 years, 800 years leading up to this point, where it was geopolitically stable, where for most of 1,000 years, the Middle East had the exact same borders. You had the Romans in the west, Persians in the east, Armenians up in the mountains. And the Armenians were a satellite state that would switch between the Greeks and the Persians. And so in Persia, you had a Christian Mesopotamia where all the cities were. And then you had a rural Iran, because Iran is mountainous. And the Iranian nobility would dominate the city dwellers in Iraq. And so the Persian Empire was demographically majority Christian, and the Persians who ruled the empire were Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrianism is actually one of the oldest of the world religions, and it's been almost entirely wiped out by Islam. But they worshipped fire, and they had this concept of the duality between the good God and the evil God who are fighting each other. There's a lot of Zoroastrian elements in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. So you have these two great empires, and they had been fighting each other. And the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian, who is possibly the best, the Eastern Roman Empire is also called the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines had possibly their best leader under Justinian, and Justinian's goal was the reconquest of the Western Roman Empire. And he was partly successful. He took over Italy, he took over North Africa, and in the process, though, the Persians fought against the Byzantines, and there were these horrifying wars. And this is one of the things that we don't really ever hear about, but this is the late 6th century. In the late 6th century, the population of Eurasia went down by half due to, there was a version of the Black Death that attacked that region in that time period, which killed half the population. And the wars between the Persians and the Greeks, that just burned down all the cities in the area. It was absolutely brutal, and it was scorched earth warfare. And this book by Tom Holland talks a lot about, this is a good source for this video because it talks about the historic events before Muhammad and then why that resulted in Muhammad. It's Tom Holland. Tom Holland's just a great writer in general. You should, between dating Zendaya, he writes some pretty good history books. And yeah, different Tom Holland. But so entire region ravaged, population crashed by half, and people just didn't have the will to keep going. And so this created this massive power vacuum in the Middle East. And so we are talking at the northern half of the Middle East. The southern half of the Middle East is Arabia. And keep in mind, the oldest civilizations in the world are from the Middle East, in which you have the Babylonians, the Persians, the Jews, the Sumerians. The Middle East is where it's where all the oldest civilizations are. But the Arabs in the southern half of the Middle East, the Arabs didn't become the Bedouin tribes, and the Bedouins are nomadic tribes of the Arabian desert. uh, they haven't been civilized ever really. Because if you look at Saudi Arabia is the desert Bedouins conquering the neighboring areas of Arabia. And so the tribes of Central Arabia, they're still wild today. There are still Bedouins who are nomads even now. And so the Bedouins always existed near these giant civilizations, but they kept their kind of own savage edge. And the more you study ancient and medieval history, the more you see these very common historical trends that moderns don't believe in. But once you study the ancient or medieval world, you see that they're incredibly, you can't not see the world without them. And one of those trends is that barbarian peoples stay tough and the barbarians conquer the city dwellers. And then once the barbarians become city dwellers, they grow weak. And so you have this giant population of tough nomadic Arabs. And Arabia was split between, and it was until like now basically, between oasis city states with trade and the nomads, because the nomads would herd animals and they would trade between the city states. But the city states themselves, they were kind of these self-isolated ecosystems where the herders could talk to each other. And this is where the prophet Muhammad shows up, where Muhammad was one of the city dwellers of the Quraysh tribe of the city of Mecca. And Muhammad was I think he was an orphan. I need to look that up. And he wasn't a prophet until like age 40. And up until that point, he was a merchant. And so ironically, because early Islam is basically the opposite of current Islam. Early Islam was the most capitalist economy in the world. And part of the reason for that was Muhammad was a capitalist. And Muhammad had multiple wives. One was like 20 years older than him, and the other was 9 years old. And this has become a big anti-Islamic sticking point that Muhammad married a 9-year-old. Different times though. But Muhammad, he started having revelations from God where he would walk around the hills around Mecca. And this is the early 7th century. And over time, Muhammad started getting more and more messages from God until the Quran was dictated to him when he was out in the desert. And he returned back to the city of Mecca with the documents of what became the Quran. And Muhammad was illiterate, and so the idea that he was able to write it, he dictated it orally from what he heard from God. And the Quran is the shortest of all the religious texts, where the Quran's 300 pages. It could be like a novel. The Bible's 1,000 pages. The Old Testament's like 500. If you add all the other Jewish teachings, it's some vast number. And Muhammad's intention with this was to, because Christianity had been around for 600 years, and Christianity had become kind of degenerate and overly bureaucratic, where as Christianity became institutionalized, a couple of things happened. As Christianity became institutionalized, there was lots of worship of idols. There were lots of bizarre superstitions. There was as the church got power, it became more corrupt and self-serving. And also, as most Christians became Europeans, Christianity became more of a European religion, even though Christianity was originally invented by a Jewish Semite. And so you saw Christianity move away from things that Semitic peoples generally like strong taboos at consumption or cleanliness, a single God, no idols, besides that, a harsh God. These are things that peoples of the Middle East have always wanted to out of their gods for thousands of years. And I would guess it's something to do with climate, but where the harsh desert creates that kind of view that you think the universe is like that. But Muhammad's goal was to make a newer, better version of Christianity. And so you can see lots of things in Islam where Islam has a more definite moral code than Christianity does, because the concept in there is that Christianity is vague enough that you can get around you can basically bureaucracy your way out of stuff. And so in Islam, for example, there's the zakat, that you have to donate 10% of your income to charity. And And so that goes to support the poor. Or Muhammad made it a much more streamlined and simple religion than Christianity. And that has both strengths and drawbacks. And my general opinion is that the Christianity and Islam as practiced today has more to do. Christianity and Islam at their foundation aren't that different. There's only a handful of religious differences between them, which really boil down to the Christian God, because the Christian God reincarnated himself through an individual. And that makes the Christian logic God more human, and the Muslim God is explicitly not human. And all of the differences, because Muhammad never claimed to be the son of God. Muhammad said, I am merely a prophet. I'm not divine. And so this one division between Christianity and Islam basically underlies all of the differences between Christianity and Islam. But I mean, it's really, one of my friends likes to say, small differences over large groups of people over long periods of time can mean the entire universe. And you saw that with Christianity and Islam.
Let's just restate that just for people really take it. Say one more time that difference and the importance of it.
So in Christianity, the Christian God reincarnates himself through a man. While in Islam, Muhammad is a prophet, and God is this incomprehensible, powerful, superior force. And so the difference in Christianity and Islam is that the Christian God has to think in human terms, the Muslim God doesn't. And so you can see this play out over history, where in Islam, and this is even more apparent, and this becomes very apparent in the era after what we're talking about, is that the Christians came to believe that the universe is rationally comprehensible. And so by studying the universe, you find God's plan. The Muslims believe that God is completely incomprehensible, so just follow the Quran, because God knows what's right, and we can't think like God. And it's also why Christianity is softer than Islam, where I'd say Islam is a significantly more masculine religion and Christianity is significantly more feminine, because God in Christianity has to appeal through human form. Well, the Muslim God doesn't. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That makes sense. Yep.
So Muhammad shows up, he establishes this, and then he has teams of followers in the city of Mecca. And Mecca is his home city. And then the Arabs didn't really know what they were doing. There were a lot of pagans. There were some Christians. There was a tremendous amount of Jews in Arabia. And ironically, Islam is much closer to Judaism than it is to Christianity. And Muhammad got lots of influences for Islam from the local Jews of Arabia. And so Muhammad said, we as Arabs, we are Muslim. We're not Jewish, we're not Christian, we're not pagan. And at Mecca, they worshiped this giant black asteroid. They were pagans who worshiped the asteroid. And so the asteroid worshippers didn't like Muhammad, so they kicked him out, made him move to Medina. Medina is a neighboring city. The Prophet Muhammad gathered an army in Medina. He conquered the city of Mecca, and then he installed himself as the ruler of Arabia. Another major difference between Christianity and Islam, where Christ was an unemployed carpenter's son who died as a criminal for a colonial empire, and Muhammad was a successful warlord. And so Muhammad unified all of Arabia, and he formed a state, and he and his buddies, Muhammad appointed his buddies. And so the period where Muhammad's friends ruled Arabia was called the Rashidun Caliphate. And you could see all of Islamic political philosophy as the attempt to create the Rashidun Caliphate. And it's kind of so you know the Sunni Shia split? Under Shia, it's through Ali, and under Sunniism, it's through Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr was Muhammad's friend, and under Shiaism, it was through his closest relative, Ali. And so it's like Orthodox versus Catholic. Orthodox versus Catholic was just a political difference. But as different areas became Orthodox or Catholic, that diverged into being actual theological differences. And it's the same thing with the Shia and the Sunni. It started out as just a political difference, and they ending up having different religious beliefs. And as of now, 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni and 10% is Shia, with the Shias being concentrated around Iran and a handful of neighboring countries. But the period around the Prophet Muhammad was a golden age for Islam. And so he built this central command of very capable people. And he also established the shared fervor in this new religion among the Arabians. And what happens next is crazy. The Muslims make the largest empire in history in like a 50-year period. And so the Muslims go out and they attack out of Arabia and they conquer, led by Khalid al-Walid, or the Sword of God in Arabic. They wipe out the East Roman Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Yarmouk, and they take Syria and Egypt. And then they wipe out the Persian Empire at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. And it's really hard to see why this happened. I've read military analyses of these, and I think Barbero has a book on this topic where he said that if the people the Muslims fought, or the Greeks and the Persians, were militarily superior to the Arabs in every way, but the Arabs had better leadership and they fought more bravely due to believing in their prophet. And so the Arabs conquered this huge area from Tunisia to India in a 50-year period with almost no struggle. And you can see why people at the time thought the Muslims were ordained by God, because that's just insane. And after all of Muhammad's buddies died, the Umayyad clan took over this empire, where the empire was moved, the capital was moved from Arabia to Damascus. And the Umayyads were one of the most powerful clans in Arabia, and they were able to use brute force to seize control of the empire. And that was controversial because the Umayyads had not originally supported the Prophet. And the Umayyad Caliphate's a weird empire where it was these local Arab their military was the Arab tribal warlords. And one of the most important things to understand about Islam is it's a tribal clan society, where in Muslim culture, every aspect of your life is controlled by your clan. You live with your family members, your parents arrange a marriage with one of your cousins, you work at your parents' business, your cousins loan you money if you need it. If you're a Muslim or an Arab, your entire life is based around clans. And so in the Umayyad Caliphate, there were these Arab warrior clans who would just occupy territory around this huge empire. And the Umayyad clan themselves had to control all of this. And the irony is that the Umayyad Caliphate, and Caliph, it's a combination of emperor and pope, because in Islam, there's no separation of church and state like there is in Europe, where the Caliph is the religious and the political leader. The Caliphate was run by Christians, where all of the governance was done by Greek-speaking Syrians, and they didn't want people to convert to Islam. They were running the Umayyad Caliphate, because there's the jizya, or a special tax in Arabic culture, where if you're ruled by Muslims, but you're not Muslim, you have to pay a special tax. And the Umayyad rulers did not want people to convert to Islam because that would lower their tax revenue. And so we have records of Muslims whipping Christians or Zoroastrians who would convert to Islam during the Umayyad period. And there were people who did convert to Islam, though, but it was still demographically a majority Christian empire. And what happened the Muslims were pretty humane and pretty enlightened governors in this time period, where a lot of the Christians of the Eastern Roman Empire, they would open the gates to the Muslims, because the thing is, they were different sects of Christianity from the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived up in Turkey and Greece. And the Muslims oppressed the local Christians more than the other Christians oppressed them. So this area of Syria and Egypt, they opened up to the Muslims with open arms. And governance under the Muslims was pretty good in the beginning. Whereas I said before, the Islam of today is not the Islam of back then. It was a capitalist, relatively free-thinking, and humane, tolerant society. Not to say that it was perfect. We can overcorrect. A lot of modern historians overcorrect, where fundamentally the Arabs were still barbarian thugs who would burn stuff down and would enslave people. But it was pretty good by medieval standards. And so the Umayyads kept expanding, and the Muslims did really well by finding peoples on the edge of the empire and converting them. In that the Berbers are the indigenous inhabitants of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. It took the Muslims several generations to conquer the Berbers, who were the people who fought the hardest. But once they converted the Berbers, the Berbers launched an independent invasion of Spain, and Spain was a Christian country run by a Germanic barbarian, the Germanic barbarian Visigoths, and which were a tiny elite over the Latin-speaking majority, and a small raiding party of Muslim Berbers conquered all of Spain. It's just absolutely ridiculous, and they pushed the Spanish up into the hills, into the north of Spain, where they would keep going there for a couple hundred years, and then like 800 years later, the Muslims reconquered Spain. But Spain became one of the wealthiest places in the Muslim world because it was super fertile and had a lot of people. And the Muslims got pretty far. They were able to convert the Persians in the eastern part of the empire, and they were able to get Persians to push into Central Asia and out towards India. So they reached the borders of India. There was a battle between a Persian and between an Arabian and a Chinese army in Central Asia, because the Chinese had their own colonial empire out in Central Asia. And that was the Battle of Talas River, where the Arabs beat the Chinese. And that's actually how paper was introduced into Europe, because the Chinese invented paper, and the Arabs brought back these Chinese artisans to make paper in the Middle East. And the Arabs pushed up against, they were stopped in Europe at the gates of Byzantium, where I like the Byzantines a lot, although I've said some trash about them in this video. And the Byzantines, they had their walled fortress city of Constantinople, and the Byzantines were able to destroy an Arab fleet. They had a thing called Greek fire, which is it's basically it's a medieval flamethrower where it's a way to project burning oil onto your enemies. They burned a Arab fleet with that, and the Greeks were able to hold on to the area around modern Turkey and the Balkans. And the Greeks were in a civil war. They had a civil war over some stupid actually, I don't think this theological difference is stupid. Sorry. They had it over a theological difference inside the empire. And as a rule, once you see, for this time period, if you see people fighting a civil war over a stupid theological difference, assume it underlies some underlying ethnic difference. So the Shia versus the Sunni was Arabs versus Persians. The people who believed in idols versus didn't believe in idols or icons in the Greek Empire, they were Anatolians versus Greeks. People used religion as a way to rationalize these underlying ethnic differences. And in Europe, the Arabs pushed halfway up France, and their goal was to conquer the Frankish Empire. And Charles the Hammer, the Frankish leader, or the French leader, was able to stop them at the Battle of Tours. And for all of this, it's incredibly impressive how far the Arabs got. They got halfway up France, they got to Greece, they had explorers out in Siberia and Central Asia, to China, to India, explorers in Africa, and the Umayyads controlled this giant empire from Portugal out to India. And it was the largest empire up to that point in history. And they instituted a golden age because finally all these thinkers who would otherwise not know of each other, you had the Greeks connecting with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Persians, with all that stuff. And so it was an agricultural revolution. It was a technological revolution. And the population grew, and the Muslims had a really good reputation because they came into power right after the Black Death. And so the population had gone down by half. So the standard of living in the early Muslim empire was really high. But then after around a century, the Umayyad Caliphate fell apart. And the reason was because the Umayyads, under the Quran, it says that all Muslims, no matter their ethnicity, should be treated equally. And what ended up happening was that as the Persian or Syrian or non-Arab Muslims, as there were more non-Arab Muslims, the Arab Muslims treated the non-Arab Muslims as second-class citizens. And so what happened was that there was a rebellion of Persian Shia, and the Persian radical Shia toppled over the Umayyad Caliphate, resulting in the Abbasid Caliphate, where they installed an Abbasid, a member of the Abbasid royal family, as ruler of the Muslim world. And the Umayyads fled from Syria out to Spain. And so Spain became an independent country, and it became one of the most important areas of the Muslim world. And the Abbasids formed this new caliphate, which stretched from Tunisia out to India. And the Berbers of North Africa, they launched a revolution which drove out the Arab conquerors. The Berbers are one of the coolest people in history that no one ever talks about. And that Berber group, they eventually became a big empire, the Fatimids, but that's not in this part of Muslim history. But the Abbasids were actually an even greater golden age than the Umayyads. And so in the Abbasid period was the flowering of Islamic science, because the Muslims started to read the ancient Greeks. And the modern West Europeans, they got a lot of their knowledge of the classics, the Greeks and the Romans, from the Muslims. And the Muslims they had a group called the Mu'tazila free thinkers. And the ideas of the Mu'tazila free thinkers were that you found God through science, and that through studying the outside world, you figure out how God thinks. And so it was a period of rationality. And the Muslim world at this point was by far the most technologically advanced and economically advanced place in the world. The cities of Alexandria, of Baghdad, Damascus, it was doing really well. And the Abbasids moved the capital from Greek-speaking Damascus in Syria to Persian-speaking Baghdad in Mesopotamia in Iraq. And so that signified the move of an empire to a more Persian, because Persia was this great empire that had been around forever. And so moving the center of power from the former Roman Empire to the Persian was this big move of, we are moving this empire towards more of a Persian cultural base using Persian institutions. And ironically, the Shia radicals formed the Abbasid Caliphate, but the second the Abbasids seized power, they turned on the Shia, converted the empire to Sunniism, and that effectively, yeah, it's just an interesting double cross. Do you have any questions before I continue?
Yeah, I mean, well, zooming out a little bit, what do you think is misunderstood about the history that we've been talking about, in terms of like, what do people not fully appreciate, or what do you think people get wrong, or have misconceptions
Yeah, that's
about?
a good school. And I just want to check: do we have till the end of the hour, or do we only have another 10 minutes?
We have 2:55, so
Okay,
20.
that's great. Okay, so yeah, I've got plenty. I got plenty to do at this time. Yeah, so you have the right wing school and the left wing school, and I don't think either are that accurate. Where there's a right wing philosophic school that says the Prophet Muhammad never existed, and I don't think that's true. And the reason I say that is that it's just Occam's razor. We have loads of records, and the entirety of it, because in Islam, religion is every single thing. Religion is the law code, religion is the politics, religion is the family structure. And that's why Muslims, if you talk to Muslims about secularism, it will just come across to them as complete social destruction. Because if you remove religion from Islam, you remove their entire social structure. Without Islam, every single part of Islamic society is based off the religion, and so the Islamic legal code is based off the Hadith, where you have the Quran, but the Hadith it's a legal code based off what the friends of the Prophet Muhammad said. So let's say Muhammad was at lunch and he said, I don't like camels. Of course, I don't mean to speak glibly about the Prophet. Let's say he just makes a remark like that. And then the entire Islamic legal code is based around, okay, he said that to his cousin. We know that because his cousin said it to his daughter, who said it to blank. So we have 3 lines of communication, thus calculating the probability of Muhammad saying this to be 20%. And so when you have that much legal architecture built around the Prophet Muhammad, I'm pretty sure he exists. And so the right like say that the Prophet Muhammad doesn't exist, and like to view the Muslims as total barbarians, which I don't think is fair. Meanwhile, the left views the Muslim Caliphate as this it's like the modern Netherlands, this multi-ethnic, tolerant, free-thinking society where there are elements of that, but this is still a medieval country. And there's this book that came out recently, The Myth of a Tolerant Muslim Spain, where they talk about this myth that Spain was this place where the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews lived in harmony. And the book was going through, no, the Muslims would arbitrarily steal from and rape the Jews and the Christians, and the Muslims were explicitly using the Jews to oppress the Christians, and they had all of these weird because the Muslims would openly legislate it to make it difficult to be an ethnic to be another religion. Like if you were Christian, you were legally not allowed to build a new church. You had to stay in these old 400-year-old churches because you weren't legally allowed to build a new one. And I think that the truth, and I must have said this in 10 videos, the truth is somewhere between the right and the left narrative, where yes, the Muslim world did very well for the time period it was in, but it's still like a medieval theocracy. Does that make sense? People
Yeah.
also have a lot of misconceptions about why the Muslim world went into decline. Most non-historians say the Muslim Empire went into decline due to the Mongols, but the reality is the Muslim world was in decline 300 years before the Mongols, and the Mongols were just the event that made it really public. So you have the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Abbasid Caliphate was ludicrously wealthy, and due to that, it hit degeneracy. And so the Abbasids are comparable to the Islamic Roman Empire. It's their big, thriving empire that they look back upon to be like, that was when we had the biggest scale. But then, like many other empires, over the course of the 9th century, the Abbasid Empire became degenerate. And there was insane wealth. There was insane, the rulers would have harems of 1,000 women. And 1001 Arabian Nights was written about the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, where Harun al-Rashid was the greatest caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate, but he was toward the tail end of things. So once Harun al-Rashid's gone, the empire goes into decline, and the elites became morally degenerate. And the thing is, Islam's period of science and secularism ended up in just complete degeneracy, where these scientist types and these rational free thinkers, they were supporting the destruction of traditional values. And this is the issue with all the empires, where all empires, once they get too wealthy, it creates degeneracy. And the Muslims were no different. And a lot of things people say about the fall of Rome were also true of the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. And it's interesting to look at the time period and to see that you keep on recycling the same ideologies again and again in history, where as the Abbasid Caliphate grew weaker, you had, first of all, Islam practiced the biggest slave trade in history. And that's for a series of complex reasons. But there was a huge population of black slaves in southern Iraq who were used for the sugar fields. Those black slaves became black anarchist rebels. So there were a slave revolt in Iraq. You had religious fundamentalist anarchist rebels in Azerbaijan. You had a variety of philosophic schools between atheism. There was syncretism, saying that all the previous Greeks and the Romans, they were really Muslim. If you say there's God, no matter who you are, you're Muslim. And so it's this really confusing mismatch. And what ended up happening was the empire spiraled apart, where Egypt became an independent state. Persian nationalists rebelled, and they kidnapped the caliphate, turning him into a puppet. And the empire spiraled off into civil war in a bunch of different disparate parts. So the Muslim world, past this point, the Muslim world would be divided until the Turks. And the Turks didn't even unify. There was this period around 1700 AD where almost all Muslims lived in one of three empires. But in the period between, with the fall of the Abbasids, Islam for the next like close to 1,000, Islam for a very long time became this squabbling mess of tiny states that's comparable to Europe, where Europe had France and Italy and that stuff. But the thing in the Muslim world was they didn't centralize into these set countries where for the French or the English or the Germans, there's a land with a shared nationality, and at least not for the Germans, shared nationality, shared government, shared identity. In the Muslim world, it would be like you are the Kalawunids, who are this nomadic tribe who rule Persian speakers, but you are not related to them and you have no sense of identity with the country. And so, as the Abbasid Caliphate fell apart, the Abbasids started hiring Turkish barbarian mercenaries. And the Turks are originally from Central Asia, or even before then, they're originally from Mongolia. And there was the Gokturk Khaganate in Central Asia. And so they were hiring these Turks from Central Asia. And the Muslims had this system because you couldn't trust anyone in the clan structure, because if you hired someone from a clan, it was their moral duty to support their fellow clan members over the centralized government. And so tribalism weakened government in the Muslim world. So what you did instead was you would hire slaves to fight for you. And so all of the top government positions in the Muslim empires were slaves, which is weird to think about. And these slaves were very wealthy, they were powerful, but these Turkish warrior slaves, they were the ones who held the reins of power. And over time, the Turks conquered the entirety of the Middle East under the Seljuk Turks, which then you can't hold together an empire in the Middle Ages. The Seljuk Turks fell apart into other states, but then the Turks invaded the Middle East. And the Turks are to the Muslim world what the Germanic barbarians are to the Romans, where in the same way the Germans attacked Rome and the Germans became this new ruling class, that happened with the Turks. And the Turks, this is segueing into the video we will inevitably make on medieval Islam, but the story, this story ends once the Persian and Arab Empire is overrun by Turkish barbarians. And something to keep in mind is at this point, the Turks didn't live in modern Turkey. They conquer that later, but so that's one shift. The empire falls apart to the Turks, and in Egypt, the Berbers conquer the Egyptian Empire. And at this point, Islam makes the most decisive choice of its history, where because the rationalists had grown so degenerate and they were complicit in the old failed empire, there was a leader named Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali, or he's more of a philosopher and thought leader, Al-Ghazali created this philosophy that studying the outside world scientifically is useless, and instead you should just read the Quran and submit to God's message, because God knows what's right in the Quran, and if God says it, it's rationally true. And if you believe in an omnipotent single God, Al-Ghazali's point is the rationally correct one to reach. But the problem is that upon reaching the conclusion that all truth is inside the Quran, you lose any incentive for science. And so Islam went from the most scientifically advanced society in the world, and it just completely fell off a cliff. And so 1000 AD is the point when Islam starts going into decay, and it's also the exact same point where Europe does better. And so as Islam went down, Europe did better. And so this is a very long process, but when you hit 1000 AD, the Muslim world, it loses its scientific ability, and it also loses its unified empire, and it loses capitalism, where the Muslims had an incredibly advanced capitalist economy, which in the ruling class of the Muslim empire in this time period was merchants. It was as capitalist as it gets. And they invented a lot of the institutions because the the Italians invented modern European capitalism, and the Italians got a lot of their stuff from the Muslims in the same way that the documents that became a lot of the Renaissance came from the Muslims. And and what happened in this time period was that the warrior classes teamed up with the church to regulate the merchants out of existence. And this again, this takes longer than this time period where it's only really in the 1300s that the Muslim world gets really poor. And we're around 1,000, but the process was already starting. And what happened was that the Muslims regulated their own economy out of existence. And this is a I wish this was the pattern people would notice more because government regulation killing the economy is really common. It's happened in China, it's happened in the Roman Empire, it's happened in Islam, it's happened in Europe, etc. And so now we've covered the time period from the rise of Muhammad to the creation of the Great Caliphate, and then to Islam, the end of Islam's golden age. Do you have any questions?
Um, no, I just want to make sure we make time to go through everything.
Yeah. And 1000 AD is also the time period when the Muslims lose a lot of different geographic territory. And so in the 11th century, the Muslims get pushed down Spain. And the loss of Spain is really important because it was one of the wealthiest places in the Muslim world. And the Muslims in this time period, they controlled the Mediterranean Sea, and the Europeans were pushed up against back into the European continent. But islands like Sicily and Corsica and Crete, they were owned by the Muslims. But then the Christians start fighting back because keep in mind, 1000 AD is when Europe starts to do better too. So the Greeks push back. They take parts of Syria. They take Crete. The Normans, or people from basically Vikings from northern France, they take Sicily and Italy. And so what happens is the Christians retake the Mediterranean. And the French historian Fernand Braudel says that once the Muslims lose the Mediterranean in the 11th century, Islam stopped its commercial dominance. And I think the point where I'm going to cut off this video is the start of the First Crusade. Because at the time of the First Crusade was in 1099, was when this Western Europe was still barbaric at this point, but it's when the Western Europeans were able to attack the heart of the Muslim world. And it kind of shows the trajectory that the Muslims at the time of the Crusades were this overly civilized, declining society, and the West Europeans were this very vigorous, barbarian society. And I mean, I really love this time period. It's one of the periods that I don't think people talk enough about. And I think there's profound symbolism in it that there's this entire society that had a rise and fall that we don't know about. And I'm known for being one of the more pro-Islamic historians, which is something I get flack for. But my speciality is the Middle Ages. And I see if the Muslims did so well in the Middle Ages, I think they have the potential to. It means they've done it once. They might be able to do it again, because the Islam of today is not what the Islam of 1,000 years ago was.
What do you think understanding this history helps us appreciate better, understand better, or interpret better sort of Islam today, or where it's going?
I see a lot of the geographic determinist argument, which is that geography determines fate. And what a lot of these people say is that the Muslims have bad geographies; they're destined to lose, or that Islam's an inherently puritanical religion, and because Islam's bad, that's when the Muslims do poorly. But I look at this where Europe and Islam have the same geography now as they did then. Europe was poor in this time period. Islam was successful. Same religions too, Christian and Islam. So what that tells me is that choices societies make about, like, let's say their economic system or their politics, that influences how they turn out. And although stuff like geography and religion are important, there are multiple ways they can manifest.
Yeah. Is that a good note to wrap on?
Yeah,
Or is there
let
anything?
me recommend some books.
Yeah.
So I talked about this book by Tom Holland. He covers the start of this time period. Um, I have heard that this is one of the best books on this time period from one of my buddies who who has studied this time period a lot. This book talks a lot about the decline and fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. And I learned that, so weird side note, there was a feminist movement in the Abbasid Caliphate where women got a lot more legal rights. And then the collapse of the Abbasids destroyed women. Muslim women 1,000 years ago had near legal equality with men, and the Muslims started oppressing women due to the collapse of the Abbasids. Um, Destiny Disrupted is the best book on this topic, and that's by Tamim Ansari. Marshall Hodgson has got a 3-volume history of Islam that's really well liked, but I thought it was really hard to read. I couldn't finish it. And this is a book I have on the Arabs that I haven't read yet. Okay, so that's Muslims. Anything else?
No, I think that's a great place
Sounds
to
good.
wrap. Any
Okay,
hints to,
I was very cognizant to keep you inside your time limit. But
no, I appreciate it,
next two
sir.
topics, I want you to choose. Pick any era in history, and we can see if I can do them.
Oh, amazing. Awesome. Well, I will think on it. I will,
Sure.
I'm open to suggestions. I'll look at the comments and we'll go from there. Awesome. Roger.
Just make a choice, man. Okay, sounds good. Peace.
Okay. See you. Bye.